Hi, I'm going to be building a simple application that will explain authentication, or at least a form of authentication using sessions and cookies. So this is pretty much what we're going to build. So I've got two users in my database. I've got some pretty simple passwords, Mo, password, capital Mo, and if I log in, you'll see that I'm logged in as Mo. You'll see that a cookie has been set here. If I refresh, you'll see I'm still logged in as Mo. If I was to go and delete this cookie, or if I was to go log out, it would have the same effect. But if I delete the cookie, I'll see that I'm no longer logged in. If I log in as Larry, I'm going to be logged in as Larry, and I could end up logging out, and I'll no longer be logged in. Also, if I end up going here and I put in, something that doesn't make a lot of sense, not a correct username and password, I end up getting this error, bad credentials, and that's what I'm going to end up building. So from an engineering perspective, what we want to do is break this down into some smaller pieces. So the first thing is that we have to have a way of identifying the user. We're going to end up doing that with a username and password. We're going to store this in a Postgres database, and we're going to use SQLize to access the data. The other thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to persist this information so that when we end up making a request to the server, we get to persist who that user is. And there's a number of ways to do this. We're going to do this with cookies, and we're going to use a module called Express Session. So just sort of a basic overview of how this is going to work is that once we end up identifying the user, we're going to store some information in the session that identifies that user's user ID. And we're going to keep track of the session with a cookie. So when a request goes up to the server, there's going to be a cookie that is going to identify the user's session. We're going to take that cookie. We're going to be able to grab the session ID from that cookie. We're not going to have to do this, but that's what's going to be done in the module. We're going to end up, from that session, finding out the user ID, and then we're going to use that user ID to look up the user so we can end up sending the appropriate response. That's sort of a high-level overview of what we're going to do. Let's talk about the different tools that we're going to use, or modules that we're going to use in order to do this. We're going to end up building this from scratch. We're going to use Express, and we're going to use Express Session. So this is a way of keeping track what user is interacting with our application, and we're going to end up tracking this with cookies because that's what we're going to end up using with Express Session. We're going to store our data in the database with SQLize and Postgres, and we're going to build this out with test-driven development using Mocha, Chai, and Supertest. So let's get started. So I've got a blank folder here. Let's actually start to set this up. I'm going to do an npm init. And there's a number of modules that I'm going to need here, so I'm going to install them. We know that we're going to need Express. We're going to need Express Session. We're going to need SQLize, and we're going to need Postgres, and I'm going to save. We're also going to need a couple of test libraries. So I'm going to do an npm install of Mocha, Chai, and Supertest, and I'm going to save these as well. I could probably make these dev dependencies as well. We can always move that a little bit later on. So in order to get started, let's open this up in my editor. And in our test here, I'm going to say test dev because this is going to be my test for my development environment. I'm going to have to connect to a Postgres database. So I want to have a database URL. And this is going to be Postgres. And for me, this is going to be localhost. And I'm going to call this my auth DB test, which I don't think exists yet, so we'll have to create it. The other thing is that we're going to need a secret for our session. So let's say session secret. And this is actually our cookies end up getting signed by this value. We're going to end up needing it, so I'm just going to make this foo at the moment. And I'm going to end up using NodeMon. I find this a little bit easier to use than using Mocha with a watch flag. I find it works a little bit better for me. And I'm going to do NodeMon. This is going to be node modules. This is going to be Mocha bin Mocha. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for my tests in the server folder. So any files with a star test.js are going to end up getting run. And let's actually just set up a basic test here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a server folder. And this is going to be my app test.js. And I'll say const expect, and this is going to be require chai expect, and I'll say describe something. We'll change this in a second. Foo equals bar. So let's say foo equals bar. What's my expectation? Foo to equal the string bar. And let's go ahead and see if we could run our tests. npm run test dev. And I'll end up finding that test. It'll end up passing. We change this to Baz. We'll see that it fails. So we have a basic test set up. And now we could go in and actually write some more meaningful tests. Let's just change our names here. Let's describe authenticating. And let's say our test is going to be user can authenticate with correct user correct. We're just going to do name and password. And we'll say user cannot authenticate with incorrect name or password. Let's take this out. Let's take this out. You still should see that we're passing, even though we're really not running in any expectations here. And let's actually start this out by doing a before each. We're going to want to make sure that we have some data in our database. So in our before each, we're going to be optimistic and return db sync and seed. Of course, none of this exists. And we'll go in here and let's start by doing a require. We'll say db equals require /db. We're just going to have a db file. And let's actually set this up. So we'll have just a db.js file. If this was a little bit bigger, we could put it in its own folder. Let's bring in our Sequelize. Do this real quick. And we're going to make our connection, which is going to be our new Sequelize. This is going to be process environment database URL, which we've defined as a process environment variable going in here. And we're just going to have our user, make this capital, con.define user. And we're going to keep this as simple as possible. We're not really worried about encrypting our passwords at this point, although in any real application you would want to do that. Let's just get the basics down here. So our password, and we're going to want to export this module because we're going to want to use it. Again, if this was bigger, you can break this up into separate files, put it in its own folder. Our models are going to be our user model, and we're going to have one other method, which we're using now, which is going to be sync and seed. And what do we want to do when we sync and seed? So this is going to be our sync and seed. And this is going to end up returning. First thing we want to do is we're going to take our connection, we're going to sync it, we're going to force it to be true. So it basically wipes out any of the tables that we're creating. And then we're going to do a promise.all, and actually I should say recreates the tables. This is going to be promise.all, and we're going to create two users. User.create, name is Mo, password is Mo, and we'll do a name of Larry, and we'll do a password of Larry, and let's just see if that was able to build here. And what are we missing? Dialect needs to be displayed. I think I have the wrong, let's just check this. I think I have an extra underscore here. Let's get rid of that. We're going to have to restart that. So this database doesn't exist. So let's go over here, create the database, try this one more time. So we've got our users that are created. Just to get rid of some of this noise here, let's just go in here. We could always set this up as an environment variable as well, but on our connection, let's just turn off our logging for now. Database is simple enough. And now when this runs, we should just see our two tests. So from this, let's actually think about what our test is gonna end up needing to do. We've got our users, now we've got to set up our tests. So let's actually go over here, and I'm going to specify that our app, we're going to require super test. So super test is basically going to be wrapping around this Express app. It's going to let us make requests and get our responses. And we're going to require /app, which doesn't exist at the moment, but this is going to need to be an Express app. And we'll go over here, and here we're going to return app.get/ we'll put a then here, which is going to be response, and we'll write some expectations with this response. We wouldn't expect this to work at the moment, but let's go over here and start setting this up by adding our app.js, and we'll end up bringing Express in here. We know we're going to need to have a port, which is going to be process environment port, especially when we deploy our application, but we'll give a default of 3000. We'll create our Express app. And we're going to want to, actually, we're not going to need our port yet. We'll need that for something else. But here we're going to do module.exports equals app. And see when we actually set up our server file, we'll need our port. But this should be enough to, let's actually write an expectation. So let's write an expectation that when we make this request, we expect a 200, which I don't expect to get because we don't have that route set up. Let's do a very simplistic route. We're going to do an app.get/, and we've got our request, response, next. And let's just set this up. We're going to use some HTML templating just to really keep it as simple as possible. And we'll go over here and we'll say that we're going to say response.send, and let's generate, let's have a method called index that will call with some data in order to get this information. Let's say const index. Let's keep it here in the same file for the moment. This is going to return, and we'll put in some HTML here. So when we call this, this should be the HTML that gets returned, and let's see, now we end up getting a 200. Let's write a quick expectation here. We'll say expect response.text to contain welcome. That should still end up passing. And let's to make sure, nice to go from red to green. Let's say not to contain welcome. That ends up failing because in fact it does contain welcome. So this is going to be, now we've basically set up our application, but now we want to have the ability to log into the application and see when we make another request that it shows that we are logged in. So one of the things that we're going to end up doing here in our application, when we end up calling this index page, let's pass in a user object. And for now, we'll go over here, just for the moment, say we don't have any user. And let's just put a little bit of code in here, try to keep this really as simple as possible. What we're going to end up doing here is we're going to do we have an object literal here. Let's go over here and we'll say, in fact, if you have a user, we're going to end up outputting one thing. If not, we're going to output it something else. So what are we going to output if we have a user? Let's do an empty string there for the moment. But if you're not a user, let's actually go in here and we're going to end up putting in a string. And we'll say log in here. And so now this shouldn't end up breaking anything, but let's go back to our test. So we should also see here to contain login, which it does. And if we went back to our app and we change this user to an object, that would fail. So let's switch it for the moment back to null. So we're going to have basically we're either going to have this, we're going to have this login information, which is going to be a form. We're going to end up putting in our values, and if we have a user, we expect to see logout, and that's something else that we'll be able to test as well. The first thing that I want to do here, again, we should be passing at the moment. What I want to do here is look at what we're going to do when we log in. So when we log in, what we're going to do is we're going to post. And we're going to end up posting to a URL, which is going to be login. And we're going to be sending, right now we're going to do this just simple form URL encoded data, name equals Mo, and password equals Mo. And we're going to do it then here. And what we expect to happen here is that when we end up getting to this point, our expectation is going to end up being, and let's actually do it this way here. We'll do return here. And what we're going to do is we're going to end up posting here. And once we end up doing that, we should end up being able to then make another request to see that we're logged in. Right now, of course, we don't even have this post request. So let's actually start setting this up. We could actually even do this. If we go over here and say we expect a 200, we'll find out that we won't get a 200. So what is this going to end up looking like? Let's set this up. The way that this is going to end up working is that we're going to have a separate route for posting. This is going to be app.post/login. And what we're going to do here is now we're going to identify the user. There's going to be a couple things that we're going to need to set up. But what we'll end up doing here is let's pull name and password from, and we're going to be optimistic because we don't have it. We're going to need to have a request.body. And we're going to attempt to find 1 with our sequelize, where we've got a matching name and password. And what we're going to do here is, if we're successful, we're going to have a user. And so let's start off with our happy path, and we'll go over here and we'll say, if we have a user, then what we want to do here is that we're going to take our request, and on our session, now this is going to totally blow up, but we'll fix it. We're going to put on our session our user ID is equal to our user ID. And at that point, we're going to do a response, and we're going to redirect to our home page, which is going to be /. Now, again, this is not going to work for a couple of different reasons, right? We have a 500 error, and probably the reason is that we actually don't have our body parser working. So let's actually install that. That was one that I forgot. And we'll go over here and start running this again. And let's go in here and actually set up our body parser. So we'll say app.use require body parser. And again, since we're going to be sending this with form data, we're going to say we want our body parser URL encoded, extended, false. which case we're probably going to get another error here. Let's just see what that is. Here it's telling us user is not defined, and that's true because we really want to bring in const, and we're going to bring in user from require /db models, right? We're going to just destructure that. And we've got another error, and it's saying, hey, look, you can't get a user ID if you don't have your session set up. Let's actually go and set up our session. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say session, and we install this already, require express session. And this goes in as middleware as well, and we say app.use session. And the only thing we really need to give this is a secret, and we'll get this from process, environment, and this is going to be our session secret. Let's just make sure that's what we ended up calling it. Session secret, looks right. So now we've got our session, so we should have a session that we can end up setting. Again, we're sort of dealing with the happy path here. And we end up getting a 302, and we're getting that because we actually have a redirect. Let's go over here and move this to a 302. So it looks like we were able to log in, but let's actually test out that now if we end up going back to our home page and we end up following this back with our cookie, that we're going to be able to see that we ended up getting logged in. So that's the next thing that we'll end up testing. So let's take a look and see what we end up getting back here. This is going to be our response. Write in expectations for this as well. But here's our response. Let's take a look at our response.headers. We should be able to see one of the headers that we end up getting back should give us the information on the cookie that it plans on setting. And this, in fact, is the cookie that Express ends up setting, and it's a combination of things. One of them is actually the session ID, but also to make sure that you're not tampering with this, this ends up getting signed, and basically we get this hash that ends up getting created with our secret. So, in fact, this cookie is valuable, but you can't end up monkeying around with this cookie. So we end up getting this cookie. What we want to test out here, let's actually just put a let up here with our cookie. And our cookie itself is going to be response.headers, and this is going to be set cookie since that's what the cookie is. And let's just write an expectation, expect cookie to be okay, meaning we ended up getting a cookie back that ends up passing. And what we're going to do here is that we're going to make another request, and we're going to end up doing an app.get, same one we did before. But what we're going to do is we're going to set a cookie. So when a cookie ends up getting set, this is how we end up. We don't have to do this manually in our application, but with our tests, and if we want our cookies to go along for the ride here, we're going to end up setting our cookie, and this is going to be our cookie that we ended up getting here. We could end up setting it, and this ends up getting returned. And let's just now write another expectation. We're going to get a response, and again, assuming that we had logged in correctly, our expectation is that we expect response.text to contain, instead of it saying log in, we expect it to say log out. This should end up failing because we don't have our log out, we just have our log in. And that's because one of the things that we ended up doing here is that we did set the cookie, but what we need to do is we need to put a little bit of middleware here that actually goes and finds the user. So what is that middleware going to look like? It's going to be fairly simple, actually. We're going to say app.use, and we're going to put our own middleware here. And we're just going to sniff around a little bit. One thing we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, look, if not request.session, okay, or not request dot session dot user ID, we really have nothing else to do here. So if we don't have a session, or we don't have a user ID on that session, we're going to end up going to next here. That should keep things relatively the same here. Let's just take a quick look. I think I have this a little bit backwards. Let's say if request.session and not request.session.userid. We'll do another next up here. We could probably clean this up a little bit. Let's just keep things from timing out here. Yeah, sorry about that. Let me just clean this up a little bit. Let's go over here and say, if not request.session, let's get out of here, return next, and let's go over here. I will say, if not request.session.userid, nothing to see here. Again, we'll clean this up at some point. Make it a little nicer to look at. This shouldn't really end up changing anything. Should really be in the same boat that we were before. Just give that another look. And also here, okay, so let's actually see what we're going to do here. If we make it over here, let's do a user dot find by ID, and this is going to be, we're going to end up getting this from the request.session.userid. Then we should have a user. Now what are we going to end up doing with this user? Again, let's sort of use happy path. We could deal with situations where we don't find the user a little bit later on. We'll go over here and just do a catch for next just to make sure if there's an error doing this. And what we'll end up doing here is we'll say on the request, the user is going to be this user. So if we end up coming in here, there's a session.userid, we're going to find that user, and then since this is our middleware, we're going to end up calling next, and we should be pretty much the same boat that we were before. But now let's modify this so that when we end up making our GET request, instead of just putting this on the user, our middleware has run, and let's say this is actually going to be our request.user. So our middleware happens up here, and after we end up logging in, we should be going back in using that session to get that user ID that we're getting from that cookie, and our tests should end up passing. So right now we've got our login, we've got our log out, and really the next thing we could do here before we start testing what's going to end up happening with a user not logging in correctly is let's also just test that we can end up logging a user out as well. So that's the next thing we'll end up doing here. Let's write another expectation here. In fact, what we'll do here is that we're going to return, and this is going to be app.get, and this will be logout. And let's assume that what we're going to end up getting here is going to be a 302. And let's just write another expectation here that if in fact once we end up getting logged out here, I don't really need anything from this response because there's really not that much there to give me. We're going to end up expecting a 302. And let's just see, even using the same cookie that we had before, at this point, we should be logged out, so I don't expect so if we logged ourselves out, even coming in with that same cookie, I'm going to put this here, and I'm going to expect this to fail at some point. I've got a number of things that are going to fail. Basically, this cookie is not really going to end up meaning anything, hopefully, when I'm done logging out, but let's build this a little bit at a time. So we don't have the log out. What does the log out look like? Let's take this one step at a time here. So we've got our post Let's do an app.get logout. And just for the moment, let's do a redirect. And we're going to do a redirect to slash. So let's just take a look at our test here. Let's actually go in here and look at our response. And what's odd here is that it is showing logout, but if we really did log out, we would expect, actually, we'd be logged out to see login. And we're not. So what are we missing here? Well, when we log out, we don't want to just log out, but one of the things we could do with a session is we could destroy it. And when you destroy the session, you end up using a callback. And within that callback, we'll do our redirect. So when we log out, we actually do want to go and destroy the session. And here, we expect to end up seeing logging in here. Our session is destroyed. We're redirecting back here. And we do expect to see login. So let's find out why we're not seeing it. Yes, I'm not sure exactly why this is failing here. Let's, at the moment, this cookie's not going to end up going back anyway, although it's a little bit less of a test by doing this. Let me just clean up a couple of console logs I put in here as well. Let's just put a couple of other things in here, and let's actually test it out in the browser to see what happens here. So we also want to make sure that if you end up trying to go in here with the bad username and password, let's do this. Incorrect name and password. So what do we expect here? We would end up coming in here with a login. And let's change this to this. Then we're going to get a response. Let's assume that we're going to have something like let's say bad credentials. Cannot read property ID of null because we were doing a happy path here. So let's pretend we're going here with a login. If we have a user, let's put in here user. And let's put in an else here. We'll go over here and we'll say that we're going to response.send and send our index file. Here we're going to have a user of null, and let's have an error with the string. So in this case, we'll go in here with an error of null, and we'll go over here to our template. And if there's an error, let's show what the error is. Otherwise, we'll just have an empty string. And let's just take a quick look at this. Error is not defined because we need to pass it in here. And let's just take a quick look at our test. Response.text. So once we have this, let's actually set it up so that we're actually could browse to it and actually put in a login form, and we shouldn't have to change too much from here. So our tests are passing, but let's actually set up our server. And what we're going to do here is let's go back to our package.json. I'm just going to modify a couple of things. Instead of this being our test.json, this is going to be our start.dev instead of our test.dev in our package.json. And instead of this being, let's make this myAuthDB. We can change the session secret if we want to. Make this a var. And we're just going to run nodemon. And we're just going to call our server. And we're going to have a file within server, which is going to be our index.js. Let's kill our testing. And here's where we're going to actually use our port that I put in before. Server.js. And here we're going to specify port. And we're going to bring in our app. That's what we've been testing on. And we'll specify app.listen, port, console.log, listening on port, and I named it server. Let me rename that to index. Let's restart it. So we're listening on port 3000. Let's just take a look and see what this looks like. The other thing that I want to do here is that I want to make sure my data is seeded. So let me specify require /db. And we'll say db sync and seed. We can always turn this on and off with an environment variable. And I'm going to get this error that this database doesn't exist. Let me create that. Let me go and run this again. So here's our login. Let's actually just put in a form here so we can test this out. And let's go to our app. And within this, let's put in a form. Be able to do this on multi-lines even within here. Let's try it out. It's not going to look pretty. Obviously, we should probably use a templating engine here. Let's say input, name is name, input, name is password, and let's actually put in, let's see if we can put this on multiple lines. It's a little bit ugly. Again, probably better off using some kind of templating engine. And let's go in here and put in a button. And in our form, let's put a method, which is going to be post. And our action is going to be login. So we've got our button. Let's open this up here. And let's do mo. And we see that our cookie ends up getting created. Let's just set up our logout here. And our logout is going to be, oh, put this in a object literal too. So this is going to be a href logout. So we can end up logging in with Mo and Mo. We could log out. We could log in with Larry and Larry. Let's also make sure that we're logged in as the user we think we're logged in as by going over here, and we'll put a log out. We'll do another object literal, which is going to be user.name. So we could say log out Mo, and if we go over here, it'll end up saying log out Larry, and if we go in here with some bad information, it'll tell us that we have bad credentials. And let's just make sure that our tests are still working. And they are. And so basically we've solved the problem with a very simple template, a little piece of middleware that looks at the session and finds the user ID, and a few different routes to be able to log the user in and out of our application.